I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we consider the crunch talks taking place in Washington over Storm Shadow missiles, the decision by Moscow to suddenly expel British diplomats, and assess Putin's latest threats to an emboldened West.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 13th of September, 2 years and 207 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, Berlin correspondent James Rothwell, dialing in from Germany, and former tank commander and chemical weapons expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. James and Hamish will be sharing their reflections on David's passing at the end of this episode. But first, I start with the latest from the battlefields of Ukraine and Russia. Let's start in Kursk, where Russia is only making marginal gains in its initial attempts at counteroffensive operations due to repeated Ukrainian attacks, military analysts suggest. According to the Institute for the Study of War and others, Moscow's forces made small advances southwest of Korenvo, but ISW experts believe Russia has only made advances in areas where Ukrainian forces were not yet fully in control or attempting to control. As such, one would expect Russian forces to face much more difficulty when they attempt to take back control of areas where Ukrainian forces are embedded. The Pentagon suggests that Moscow's counteroffensive against Ukrainian forces in Kursk is only marginal at this stage, with Pat Ryder saying, and I quote, "What we have seen is Russian units beginning to try to conduct some type of counteroffensive there. At this stage, I would say that it is marginal, but something obviously that we're keeping an eye on." So, to stress, this seems more likely to be Russian probing than the major attempt to dispel Ukraine's forces from Russian territory. It bears repeating that Kyiv said it has taken 1,300 square kilometres of land across more than 100 settlements and held on to much of that. Many experts didn't believe that Kyiv would hold the territory for more than a few days, yet as we predicted on this podcast, due to the political significance of holding on to territory at this moment, Kyiv seems set to remain for as long as possible due to the leverage it provides. But more on that with Roland later. Staying in Kursk, a Ukrainian HIMARS strike reportedly damaged a temporary pontoon bridge across the same river and inflicted casualties on a group of nearby Russian troops yesterday. The Ukrainian unmanned systems forces claimed that the Russian troops were preparing to conduct assaults against Ukrainian positions in the area. While we're on the subject of long-range weapons, there has been some geolocated footage circulating online this morning that would suggest that Russia is relocating planes out of ATACMS range, which would perhaps imply that whatever Moscow says publicly, it is expecting there may be soon some prospect of more aircraft being within striking distance of Western weaponry donated to Kyiv. Though these movements of aircraft don't negate the significance of longer-range strike capabilities, there are still many targets like command nodes, fuel depots and military bases. Nonetheless, it does underscore what we said yesterday, that the fact this is being so publicly talked about, the permissions issue, is giving Moscow a chance to prepare. Just one final thing on Kursk. Russian authorities have reportedly deployed additional elements of the Russian 106th Airborne Division to Kursk Oblast, and experts believe may begin redeploying more combat-experienced troops to further support the future counteroffensive operations there I was just describing. Russian authorities have relied largely on poorly trained and equipped conscripts and small elements of Russian regular and irregular forces to address the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk thus far, and will likely require additional manpower and more combat experienced units to fully push Ukrainian forces from that incursion. Now, turning to the Ukraine front, Russian forces continued limited ground attacks north and northeast of Kharkiv city, but did not make any confirmed gains over the past 24 hours. Ukrainian Kharkiv Group of Forces spokesperson Colonel Vitaly Solantsev stated yesterday that Russian forces in the Kharkiv direction have started committing conscripts to battle. Putin has previously promised that Russia will not deploy conscripts to combat operations in Ukraine, but the Russian military has relied on conscripts, as I say, for border security and to respond to the incursion in Kursk. ISW, I should add, has not observed confirmation of conscripts participating in Russia's offensive operation in northern Kharkiv Oblast or elsewhere in Ukraine. But nonetheless, the fact that Kyiv are talking about this is itself interesting. While certainly not all quiet on the Eastern Front, it would appear that elsewhere in Ukraine, despite Russian attacks, there is little evidence of major gains, nor of an impending major Russian advance in the Donbass over the coming days. Russia has cut off water supplies to the city of Pokrovsk as Moscow continues its assault on Donetsk, though, and locals have been urged to evacuate immediately. For those especially interested in that sector, I recommend listening to Wednesday's episode with Tom Much, who was just there and paints a very vivid picture of the situation, which is serious, but perhaps not as dire as some of the reports that we were getting a week or two ago. The Russian strategy at present militarily is clearly to continue pressure on all aspects of the front, particularly in Donbass, as they prepare for more sustained assaults in Kursk and ensure that they have the capacity and ability to grind down Ukraine's energy facilities. 6 regions were struck in Ukraine last night. The energy issue remains of paramount importance, and only expect that issue to become ever more urgent over the coming weeks as the weather begins to turn autumnal here in Europe. Already, there is a chill on the breeze here in London this morning. So that's the military latest. But Roland, I think it's fair to say that the major story today continues to be about the US and UK discussions on Storm Shadow permissions. Moscow has come out punching, as it were, being preemptive, and has done some interesting things this morning. Where do you want to start on this?
Do you know what? I think actually to lead into this, it might be good to start on something which on the surface is not really about storm shadows. It's about something else entirely. And yet it seems to underline just how tense this week, and I mean really tense, more tense than normal, things are becoming, particularly between Russia and Britain, and particularly it seems in the context of this discussion about storm shadows. So the support act here is this morning, the FSB, the Federal Security Service of Russia, the main successor agency to the KGB, says it is stripping 6 British diplomats at the embassy in Moscow of their diplomatic accreditation, basically on suspicion of spying. We'll actually get to the actual charges against them in a second. But this is what the FSB say. They say that these 6 diplomats worked for the FCDO's, Foreign and Commonwealth Officers, Eastern Europe and Central Asia Department. The FSB says that department was, the quotation is, transformed into a special service with the goal of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia in February 2022 after the full-scale invasion. The FSB statement says the agency received some documents, and the documents in question is the quote, indicate that in Great Britain, the leading unit coordinating the implementation of subversive policies in the Russian direction and in countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union is the Directorate. That's really just the Russianish kind of KGB-sounding word for department or section. The Directorate of Eastern Europe and Central Asia of the British Foreign Office, which was transformed after the start of the special operation in Ukraine to a special service whose main task is to inflict a strategic defeat on the country. The FCDO has strongly denied this. It's put out a statement this morning saying the accusations made by the FSB against our staff are completely baseless. The Russian authorities revoked the diplomatic accreditation in response. Yeah, so it said completely baseless. The Russian authorities revoked the diplomatic accreditation of 6 UK diplomats in Russia last month, following action taken by the UK government in response to Russian state-directed activity across Europe and the UK. We are unapologetic about protecting our national interests. That's the British response. And this is the kind of interesting bit about this. The FSB have not directly said these people are spies. It says we found in their behavior signs of intelligence subversive work were found. So in other words, the FSB concluded these people are behaving in a way which means they might be intelligence officers, but we can't tell. That's as far as the FSB statement goes. But in a state television report, which goes a bit further than the FSB's official statement, which doesn't give the names of the diplomats, State TV gave the names, published some photos of the diplomats. It's 3 men, 3 women. And then the reporter asks, well, what were they doing? And they have a voice on, which is presumably an FSB spokesperson, slightly muffled, who says, frankly, we were tired of this circus. of jogging along the third ring road in Moscow in the rain, in the freezing cold, taking a one-day trip to another city to just sit on a park bench and then come back, taking, sudden changes of taxis and vehicles, and meeting with human rights groups called, the Russians call, foreign agents. So in other words, the Russians are saying these guys were using good old-fashioned Cold War style tradecraft that you might see in a Le Carré novel, and that's why we're getting rid of them. But they haven't actually publicly accused them of any particular wrongdoing or espionage. And the reason I've talked about all that is because it's very much aimed at Britain. And if you pick up our paper today, you will see our colleague Ben Riley-Smith, our political editor's interview with David Lammy, in which David Lammy really leaves no doubt that Britain is lobbying quite hard with the Americans. Britain is lobbying the Americans, reading between the lines, to change their stance on long-range strike into Russia. And that is, there are massive tensions around that, Francis. And I know I've given you that preface to that with the spy story, but I kind of thought it was important to underline just how tense things are. I hope you don't mind. Would you like me to go on and flesh out the missiles themselves?
Please do. It does feel like that one of the questions that we've had this week is, was it Britain, was it Washington that was thinking in terms of being the impediment on Storm Shadow's permissions? It would appear now that the answer is very much from Washington. So yes, let's get into now. Keir Starmer is over there, of course, British Prime Minister. What are you seeing on the Storm Shadows, particularly this morning?
Right, okay, so this is it. The spy arrest comes in the context of Keir Starmer flying to Washington today to see Joe Biden. It's a surprise summit. It's their second meeting since Keir Starmer became Prime Minister. And it's been trailed as an opportunity to discuss kind of strategic matters. And Ukraine is really up there, as far as we're aware. And the understanding is one of the big things is this knotty question of whether or not the West gives Ukraine permission to fire long-range missiles, Western-provided long-range missiles, deep into Russia, like permissions for deep strike, essentially. Now, David Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary, and Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, both went to Kiev over the past couple of days before this summit with what they said was the goal of speaking to President Zelensky, speaking to other Ukrainian officials, the Ukrainian leadership, so that they could inform their respective national leaders, Keir Starmer and Joe Biden, about just what it is Ukraine needs. And it's pretty clear what the Ukrainians want. President Zelensky's been very clear. He wants, though, that permission for deep strike. So Ben Riley-Smith was with David Lammy. This is what the Foreign Secretary told Ben on this subject. This is a crucial period this is David Lammy speaking after a day of meetings with Antony Blinken and with President Zelensky and other Ukrainians in Kyiv. This is a crucial period in the fight because we are setting things up to stop Russia getting the advantage over winter. We're here also, of course, at a time when it is crystal clear that Russia is receiving missiles that will be used in the winter, sadly, against the Ukrainian people and which will cost lives. So, of course, we're here to strategize, to understand how we can put the Ukrainians in a position to win and what is needed. Now, as Ben points out, the use of the verb to win is something that Western leaders have often avoided. And the argument that it's Russia here, it's the one that's escalating because they're getting missiles from Iran and therefore it's legitimate for the West to respond, it hints that is, in diplomatic speak, I think it's fair to say that is a hint at support from the British Foreign Office to giving the Ukrainians the green light here. So the reading between the lines is that in the British side of this summit, there will be a kind of an effort to say to Biden, look, we really think that the time has come to lift that. Now, what's the Russian response? They're seeing this debate going on. Vladimir Putin has made a very clear threat, really. This would, in a significant way, change the very nature of the conflict. It would mean that NATO countries, the US, European countries are at war with Russia if those deep strike permissions are granted. So that's Vladimir Putin's response. It's very clearly meant to warn people off, warn particularly the Americans off from making this decision. Will this decision be made? Well, who knows? We reported earlier, Francis, this week. First of all, there was, Blinken and Lammy were speaking in London, and we had the feeling that something might change. And then we were getting sources were telling us actually it might be this week that the permissions were lifted. Now CNN's been talking to American officials who are kind of briefing behind the scenes. Well, we don't think there's going to be an imminent shift. Politico this morning reporting that, well, actually the permission for deep strike might come not after Friday, but at the or during or after the UN General Assembly meeting in New York later this month. So it's really difficult to tell, actually, to get just how fast this pulse is going. But we know the question is being debated in quite serious ways. And we also know from reporting from American media and other media, to be fair, that there seems to be a split in the US government about this. As we understand, the State Department, led by Mr. Blinken, is much more bullish about this than, for example, the Pentagon and the national security establishment, who are a bit more cautious about the wisdom of that. And again, at the centre of this debate, Francis, is that question about the red line. And Vladimir Putin has very clearly tried to reinforce that, given the impression that, look, Russia will have its own interpretation of what this means. And Russia saying, we will respond if you do that, and we'll respond in a way that you don't like, and it might be quite dangerous. What would that look like? Well, say a strike on a NATO country, say the Russians say, okay, well, you're doing that. That gives us the right to, for example, hit that really important transport hub in Rzhev in Poland, where huge amounts of NATO kit flies into on its way to Ukraine. But I think there's no doubt that with this question, things are really, really tense between the West and Russia right now.
Thanks, Roland. So fascinating, this, and we'll, of course, be returning to it a lot, I think, over the coming days. I would add that Russia can't really complain about NATO countries sending long-range weapons when it is itself receiving long-range weapons from Iran. North Korea is providing all of that military support. China too, some would argue. If that's how it worked, the logic that Putin's putting forward, Iran and North Korea would be at war with Ukraine right now because Russia attacks Ukraine with their drones and missiles. They are not. So that just is worth reiterating. Also, if we think back to the very first day of the invasion, more or less, I remember Putin saying, and I've dug out the quote, that those who may be tempted to interfere from the outside risk our wrath. No matter who tries to stand in our way or create threats to our country and our people, they must know that Russia will respond immediately. And the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history. Well, eventually, Western leaders saw through that and the nuclear saber rattling that followed, and has since provided Ukraine with tanks, advanced missile systems, and most recently the F-16 American fighter jets. So there has not been a profound escalation as a result of that, and I would wager that there would not be a profound escalation if Storm Shadow permissions were granted too. And it speaks to the urgency of the fear that Putin fears that the West will see through the statements that have been made as to why he has been making quite remarkable remarks today in the format that he has, one-on-one to camera. But thanks, Roland. We'll come back to you later on. But first, I want to come to James Rothwell for the latest from Germany and Europe. James, thanks for dialing in from Deutschland. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk said today he's not worried about Putin's comments. He said, and I quote, "It is necessary to take all events in Ukraine and on the Ukrainian-Russian front very seriously, but I would not attach excessive importance to the latest statements from Putin. They rather show the difficult situation the Russians have on the front." What's your sense, though, as to the response in Berlin to that kind of rhetoric coming out from Putin?
No, thank you, Francis. So Chancellor Olaf Scholz has addressed the war in Ukraine today, but interestingly enough, he didn't talk about this particular warning from Putin. He instead talked about the war in the context of populist parties in Germany who are voting for Russian-friendly parties like the AfD. And I think that tells us something, which is that Scholz today and this week has had an absolute nightmare in terms of his domestic politics for reasons that we can get into in a moment related to borders. And he basically said in this little gloss on the war that populist parties in Germany that are getting this big increase in voters, they're basically tricking German voters into thinking that they've got it right on the war in Ukraine. The AfD, for example, very Russia-friendly, very much opposed to military support there. There was even the suggestion from Scholz that German voters who abandon the mainstream parties and are going into the arms of the AfD just don't quite understand the situation geopolitically, which may not go down very well with German voters. What I would say in terms of Germany's perspective on this latest warning from Putin is that they will be concerned that if Putin retaliates, it may be asymmetric. and it may target Germany. As Roland said earlier, the calculation on the Russian side may be, well, there's been a strike from NATO on us, so there will be a strike from us back on a NATO state, which could be Germany. The reason I bring this up is that we know one of Germany's unique vulnerabilities as a country that used to have the former GDR in it, is that there are pro-Russian Germans inside the country. Russia does not need to sort of import people into Germany if they wanted to carry out some kind of attack on infrastructure or a more overt attack along the lines of this wider row that's going on this week. And so that will be a concern for the Germans. The question of whether the Germans' risk appetite may have increased over the summer is quite an interesting one. You'll remember, Francis, that German tanks were in Kursk for the counteroffensive for the first time in World War II. There'd been this kind of silent assent from the Germans for that to happen. So I'm looking out for more political response from the Germans on that theme today. It'll be interesting to see if Mr. Scholz does address it specifically. But his modus operandi on this issue is generally to be a passenger and to follow what the Americans say. And my guess is that's probably how he'll tackle this particular issue.
Well, thanks, James. It'll be really interesting to see whether Scholz does make any kind of statement. It was quite interesting on Monday to see, again, Scholz saying that Germany is very much behind Ukraine and wants to be seen as this absolute premier power in terms of the support that Germany is offering Kyiv. And yet there are a lot of caveats to throw in, as you just have, and indeed they are still very much holding back on granting tourist permissions. And indeed that, of course, is another of the reasons why the debate around storm shadows and the pressure is very much on these discussions, is because those long-range missiles, and I know that each missile is different and the ranges are different, the capabilities are different, but nonetheless, because of that hesitation, because of that delay, because of that just lack of commitment on the statement of tourists, and it would appear that there's been no real profound movement on that, it does mean that these discussions taking place in Washington matter all the more. And so it just bears repeating that. But James, I know you've also made an interesting trip to East Germany this week to speak to another German populist leader. Just tell us about that, because it does seem that there's a lot of new names coming up that may well be relevant for the future.
Yes, that's right. There's a lot of new names, or new names to our British audience at least, kind of exploding onto the German political scene at the moment. One of them is Björn Höcke, a senior figure of the AfD. He swept to victory in state elections in Thuringia on the state election on September the 1st. First time the AfD, which is very Russia-friendly and opposed to military support for Ukraine, has won a state election. And yesterday, I went to go and see another big new name in German politics give a speech, and that was Sarah Wagenknecht, who is the leader of a new left-wing and Russian-friendly populist party called the BSW. And I went to see her give a speech in Frankfurt and Oder, which is right on the Polish border, so close to the Polish border that you can actually walk across a bridge and find yourself in Poland, a country, of course, that is very supportive of Ukraine. And Russia came up a lot in her speech. And it's worth stressing that the BSW is going to become potentially a very big player in German politics. We've got a state election in Brandenburg, the state I was in East Germany, coming up in about 2 weeks. And the thing about Sarah Wagenknecht is that she's an old school left-wing politician. She used to be immensely popular when she was in Die Linke, but she fell out with her party because she used to criticize large amounts of migration coming into Germany. And so she went off and founded this new party, the BSW. And when she spoke yesterday, she spoke, I would say, with significant amounts of nostalgia, really, about the GDR, about the former communist satellite state that East Germany used to be. She spoke about the quality of the education in the GDR, how it was better than what they have now. And she also expressed concern, and this is a big theme for those Russian-friendly political parties in Germany. She spoke about the concern of nuclear war with Russia as a result of the war in Ukraine. And this was being absolutely lapped up by the crowd, thunderous applause, particularly when the dangers of military support for Ukraine came up. And this is going to be important in the context of German politics. I said we've got this state election coming up soon, but there's also a national election coming up in Germany, probably in late 2025. If the BSW and the AfD continue to perform very strongly, they might well potentially be in the next coalition, depending on what the results are. They may become the main opposition voice in Germany as well. And this is going to further dilute German support for Ukraine, and that's why it matters. We don't know what stage the war in Ukraine will be by late 2025. It might potentially be a moment in the war when negotiations are going on to ending it. It's unclear. But even so, the role that Germany plays as one of Europe's leaders is going to be very significant. And I came away from this rally in Frankfurt and Oder with this real sense that the mainstream parties of Germany, which are broadly supportive of Ukraine, not as much, you could say, as, say, Poland or the United Kingdom, but they are on the whole supportive. They've made immense financial contributions to Ukraine. They are really being chased by these Russian-friendly populist parties at the moment, and it is going to have, as I said, a significant impact on that major national election coming at the end of 2025.
Well, fascinating. Thank you so much for that, James. And as you say, there is a real nostalgia in parts of the East for the days of East Germany when it was controlled by the Russians. Ostalgie is the term that's often used to describe that. And for those interested in that, I highly recommend a book by Katja Hoyer called Beyond the Wall, which really is the history of East Germany. And it speaks to some of the phenomena that's taken place since with regard to people looking back more fondly on that time for all sorts of political reasons in Germany. But let's go now to Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Been waiting very patiently, Hamish, for which we're very grateful. Lots to get into with you today. Let's start then on the debate around storm shadows and this nuclear saber rattling from Putin. When you saw that today, Hamish, I think I can imagine what you're going to say, but what was your first response when you heard those remarks?
Yeah, it was exactly that saber rattling. And I think the most useful thing I can do really is to unpack the nuclear piece here, because I think that's what's really got everybody. And that's what Putin wants people in the capitals across Europe and in Washington today to really think about it. And people are asking, are we turning from a Cold War to a hot war? I think, first of all, on Storm Shadow and why it is so important. It's, we gave Storm Shadow to the Ukrainians some time ago. It's been very successful, very useful. But we've sort of given half a Storm Shadow. We haven't given the full ability, and it's almost, if you use the sort of balling simile, it's like we arrange a football match between Ukraine and Russia, but we tell Ukraine they can only have a goalkeeper. So the key thing to me about Storm Shadow and similar capabilities, but we're talking about Storm, is its ability to strike, 400 kilometers or so across the border, which is where a lot, as has already been said, a lot of the attacks are launched from. Putin and others were saying, well, the Brits and the Americans are now involved because they're using GPS data to enable it to cross the border. Well, that's not new. And, that's been happening for some time. So I think there is no peace there. I think from a British perspective rather than an American perspective, we've got to remember that, Washington is 4,000 miles or so from Ukraine. And their perspective is certainly slightly different from ours. So what does Storm Shadow bring us? I think, to me, it takes the whole nuclear argument off the board, because any tactical, and I'm talking tactical, I'm dismissing Armageddon. Strategic nuclear strike, just not going to happen. And that might be another pod. But at the tactical side, they would have to be launched from within this area, be they Iskander missiles or on jets. And this negates the ability for them to do it, because Ukraine, and I'm sure in close consultation, could prevent this happening. I've just been listening to a program on a BBC radio show in the last couple of hours, and a Stop the War Coalition person saying, well, Putin would never use tactical nuke in Ukraine because, and if he did, all the nuclear waste would head towards the West. Well, that's not strictly true. And having chatted to somebody in Odessa this morning, the weather looks very nice. To me, that's symptomatic of a high pressure zone. And in that case, actually, any nuclear fallout would go east, not west. So, would Putin really do that? Fire something, into the Donbass or whatever? I think what I'm trying to say is the escalation to nuclear is virtually impossible. And I hope that people making decisions in Washington today absolutely realise that, because I think it's that nuclear sea anchor That has delayed all the weaponry that Roland has described trickling in to Ukraine. So, yeah, I hope the decision is made. I can't see the escalation apart from in the sort of asymmetric type warfare, which is sort of going to happen anyway. And actually, I think, we had the brief from head of CIA and head of MI6 last week. I had a very interesting chat to an ex-head of MI5 yesterday. And I think we're in agreement that actually, that Western security services probably have a slight edge. And whether that's related to people being dismissed from Moscow today, who knows? So to me, I think there is very little chance of escalation. I think the nuclear issue is a chimera and should be taken as such. And I hope that this evening or tomorrow we're going to hear that actually Ukrainians can now weapons free, as we call it, with Storm Shadow.
Well, thanks for that, Hamish. And just before we go to our final thoughts, I also know that there were some updates earlier in the week that Dom was talking about on chemical weapons. And just wanted to hear, because obviously you're our resident expert on that, as it were. What are your thoughts on the latest developments in that space this week?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I heard Dom sort of articulating exactly what was happening earlier on in the week. And by coincidence, actually, I was talking to some senior commanders down in the south only 2 nights ago, I think, because this is, and Dom did cover it, this is ongoing. Some units have been hit 2 or 3 times a day with CS gas and chloropicrin, which is the Russian riot control agent. And we've discussed it before many times, but it's sort of going on in the shadows. I was at this conference in London over the last couple of days, which was sort of confidential-ish because of the people who attend it, and from across the political, security and journalistic spectrum. And I gave a quick brief on this, and most people were astounded it was happening. And I explained how effective it was being, although it's just riot control agent, which, of course, as Putin tells us, we use all the time on our people who will descend across Europe. Actually, it's incredibly effective because although it doesn't directly kill people in the trench, once they get out, they get hit. And what I and others have been trying to do is to mitigate that by giving some training advice. And you might remember at the beginning of the war, we produced a training course on Telegram that anybody could use to tell them how to survive from our experiences in Syria. And likewise, we're reinforcing that now. But we're trying to get as many gas masks as possible, knowing that the Ukraine government have already asked for it. I understand that one of the European governments, and I think it's pretty confidential, so I can't really say who, have already fessed up, several thousand, which is great. And we're trying to get more. But certainly talking to commanders down in the Donbass, a lot of the gains being made in that area are due to this, because the Russian troops, the conscripts on the front line now are barely trained and can barely do anything except walk forward and fire until they're inevitably cut down under a sort of chemical barrage of chloropicrin and CS gas. So it's still happening on a regular basis. Training, I know there are people out there training them, helping them to do it, but the gas mask is the horseshoe nail that will prevent this horseshoe falling off, and we're desperately trying as hard as we can to get masks to the front. But funny old thing, if you ask somebody in Kyiv whether they want a few more Storm Shadows or a couple of 100,000 gas masks, it's actually quite a difficult decision. Both are critical, but I hope we're making progress.
Well, thank you very much for that, Hamish. Let's go to our final thoughts then. Roland, you've had a little while to listen to what James and Hamish have been saying there. Where do you want to end our listeners with today?
I've just got a few things to kind of add, which I hope will kind of add to food for thought on all these topics. I mean, the first thing on what Hamish was saying about asymmetric response. So Putin was actually asked this question some time ago, back in June, in fact. What would you do if Ukraine was able to fire Storm Shadows, autocams, whatnot, into Russia? And he said then, well, we'll improve our air defences and we'll shoot them down, for one thing. Fair enough, I suppose, perfectly within the rules of warfare. And then he said, second, we believe if someone is thinking it's possible to supply such weapons to a war zone to strike our territory and create problems for us, Why can't we supply our weapons of the same class to those regions around the world where they will target sensitive facilities of the countries that are doing this to Russia? So there's another clue. It might not mean striking a NATO state directly. It might mean, I don't know, handing some pretty decent missiles to, I don't know, Iran, Hezbollah, I don't know, some other groups or countries adversarial to the West who might hit US, British, other assets around the world. It's another clue, I think, into the kind of thinking in Moscow about, okay, how will we actually respond in a way? And remember that the Russians, they're also, I reckon, kind of as preoccupied with deconfliction as the Americans. I don't think the Russians want to get into a shooting war with NATO either, and that's why the brinksmanship comes into it. And that's why I think that really in Moscow they'll be thinking, okay, we do have to come up with a response to this if it happens. But they're also going to be thinking of, okay, well, how can we do that and hurt the West without actually starting Armageddon and World War III. So lots of different ways you might see that develop. But the main thing, and I'll try to be brief because Hamish and James have got things they want to say, but I've been thinking about timelines essentially, and one of the reasons is that we've got lots of timelines in this war. One of the timelines is that it's indefinite and it's going to go on until another 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. Who knows? Some people have been saying in fact, I've been saying earlier this week on this podcast, well, I can kind of see signs that there's an effort to get to a negotiating table in the next little bit. I just wanted to read out, it's actually a quote from Ben Riley-Smith's interview with David Lammy that I picked out because I think it's quite informative. So according to Ben, the understanding is that Lammy, Blinken, Zelensky, they were really sitting down and talking about the minutiae on the battlefield and how what each option they have would affect the war and so on. And then Lammy tells Ben afterwards, the mainstay of what we talked about on this trip is really the next horizon, those next 4, 5, 6 months into the spring, making sure Ukraine is in the strongest position it can be to win. So there you've got them talking about, we know this is going to be a hard winter, and we've reported a lot about how hard the winter is going to be because of the damage on infrastructure. That gives us a horizon of, Western allies thinking about Ukraine and its Western allies thinking about getting through the winter. And I was also, just on that thought, I had been thinking, you look at the Kursk operation, which looked like gaining leverage for talks. You look at how President Zelensky has talked about we need a new peace summit with Russia there. You look about all the concern about, especially while Joe Biden was still in the race, about Donald Trump coming in November and perhaps forcing a ceasefire on Ukraine that it doesn't want. Maybe there was an effort to lock things down before that happened. But I also spoke to Alexei Goncharenko, a very switched on, bright MP for Odessa, actually, yesterday. And I asked his view on this, and he said, look, and this is a very good point, which I think we should remember about the Kremlin attitude to things. He said, look, I don't buy that idea that there's going to be any rush to talks before the election in America. In fact, I don't think there can be, because the reality is the Russians, they really want to talk to the Americans. They don't want to talk to Ukraine. They want to talk to the Americans, and they want to know which American president, which new administration they are going to be dealing with, which is it's a good thing to remember, that one way of understanding what Russia wants is to be recognized as a great power alongside the other great powers, the United States and China, and to be able to divide the world into spheres of influence. So I think there's a lot in that, and I think we should, that's just one way of something to chew on as we're thinking about where we are in this conflict and whether we are nearing the end or whether this is going to run on for a long, long time. But I'll leave it there, and thank you very much to everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Roland. Food for thought, as you say. James Rothwell, you next. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
Thank you, Francis. And thanks also for the opportunity to say a few short words about David on the podcast. What I'd like to say is that even though David and I were the same age, I looked up to him and I really admired him. And I think that when a dear colleague or friend dies, you should take a part of them that you admired and absorb it and carry it with you. And I admired lots of things about David. His 4 trips to Ukraine, his boundless enthusiasm, his understated leadership style, and his resilience above all else. Despite the dark subject matter that he covered with such precision, he never became cynical or bitter about the war. And I think that's why so many of our listeners, particularly our Ukrainian listeners, enjoyed his work so much. Now, David, as you actually heard from Roland in Wednesday's episode, was a J.R.R. Tolkien fan. And in between recording episodes, me and David used to swap Lord of the Rings quotes on Gmail chat that were linked to the stories we discussed on the podcast or other stories in the UK media. And he actually once did a very convincing impression of Tom Bombadil, this mercurial, magical character from the Lord of the Rings, with David imagining him as a House of Commons MP, giving an impassioned speech on environmental laws to protect the old forests of Middle-earth, which really tickled me at the time. But I've been thinking a lot, actually, about the Lord of the Rings since David's death. When this war began, as you guys will remember, many Ukrainians actually found some solace and comfort in the story and the themes of the Lord of the Rings, which seemed to reflect back on them, their own experience of the war. In those early days of the invasion, Ukrainian soldiers would refer to Russian invaders as orcs. Putin, lurking in the Kremlin, was often compared to Sauron in Mordor. And the ordinary Ukrainians who got up and went to work every day, despite the air raid sirens, the iron people who worked the railways so that the country stayed on track, the diplomats who advocated for Ukraine, and the journalists who investigated Russian war crimes. They were almost like the hobbits of that story, staying optimistic and persevering in the face of immense danger and uncertainty. So I just want to end my final thought and my tribute to David Knowles with a quick quote from The Lord of the Rings, which I feel speaks to his resilience as a journalist and the resilience of the Ukrainians he so diligently reported on. It's also a quote that I found some comfort in this week, thinking about David's death, and it speaks a little bit to the future of this podcast, which is continuing with Francis and Dom at the helm and with our talented production team. It's a quote taken from The Fellowship of the Ring at a moment when Frodo Baggins, the protagonist of the story, is feeling daunted by the task ahead of him of taking the ring to Mordor and destroying Sauron. And in this moment, he seeks counsel from Gandalf, his mentor and elder. And the quote is, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." Rest in peace, David.
Well, thank you very much, James, for those very moving reflections. Hamish, what are your final thoughts for us?
First of all, I mentioned this summit I've been at this week, attended by royalty, attended by journalistic, scientific, political, military, security royalty from all over the world. And virtually everybody came up to me and said how desperately sad they were to hear of David's passing. Said that Ukraine, the latest podcast, was their window into Ukraine. And I find that immensely reassuring because I think you guys do a fantastic job here. But it was that spectrum of some of the most important people on the planet who might not have known David, but they certainly knew about him. And to explain David Knowles to me, the final verse of the most famous poem does a lot better than I ever could. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you are a man, David Knowles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamish. Friends, it's been a tough few days for all of us here, but if there's any joy to be found in this week amidst the acute sadness we share, it is seeing just how many lives David touched and how many Davids there really were. The brilliant reporter, the talented musician and classical music lover, the cricketer, the historian, the linguist, and the lover of life. He was endlessly talented, and somehow I think all of those aspects of his character ran through his work in ways that meant he was endlessly fascinating to tune into. Whilst taken from all of us far too soon, he leaves an incredible legacy, and all of us who had the privilege of knowing him here at The Telegraph are committed to making sure the work he started with Ukraine the Latest continues. The whole team here, including the producers, have asked me to pass on their profound gratitude for the kind words of support that have come in from every medium in every corner of the world this past week. You truly have kept us going. And I just wanted to end the episode by reading a very short extract from David's obituary in The Telegraph, which we'll link to in the show notes to those who want to read it in full, and I highly recommend that you do. David Knowles, the journalist who has died, aged 32, was known and cherished by a huge number of listeners all over the world for his dedicated work presenting The Telegraph's award-winning Ukraine the Latest podcast. A naturally gifted broadcaster, he was a reassuringly authoritative presence who never pushed his own personality into the foreground, even though he felt deeply about the fate of the Ukrainian people. Each episode would open with his clear and gentle tones against the background of a quietly insistent percussive musical theme. The podcast became a runaway hit. It is fast approaching 100 million downloads, prized by listeners, including senior players in the war, for the granular detail in which it illuminates day-to-day events in the conflict. After news emerged of Knowles' death from a suspected cardiac arrest, listeners began posting comments in droves, many recording their feelings that he had become like a member of the family. Outside journalism, interests ranged from cricket — he was not very good, but loved it so much he set up his own team — to the history of the Napoleonic Wars. Friends might not be surprised to be asked who their favourite general in Napoleon's army was. He enjoyed translating Hebrew texts and had rediscovered an appetite for playing Warhammer with old school friends. Intensely musical, he played the viola and later the mandolin, sang as a tenor with university choirs, and loved summer tours to Europe with Ealing Youth Orchestra. He was also prone to spontaneous gestures of generosity, such as, after joining the Southbank Centre in London, taking out tickets for a dozen or more concerts in a season so that he could invite different friends every night. Knowles is survived by his parents, by his younger brother Andrew, a civil servant at the Ministry of Justice, and by his grandmother. And as I say, we'll have a link in the show notes for those who wish to read the obituary in full. All of the core team yesterday went to St Bride's Church, the Journalist Church here in London, and lit a candle each for David. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it to those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You also contact us directly on X, formerly known as Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Elliot Lampert. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.